Week 2 of Denver Broncos OTAs means that the quarterback competition is expected to take the next step in its development. What would we like to see from all three quarterbacks this week? We'll break it down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's up? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get this show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So do us a favor, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day, all year long. If you listen to us once or twice per week, bump that up to 5 times a week. We have a brand new episode, fresh with objective coverage and analysis, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. You can also catch us on YouTube as well. Engage with members in the comment section. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. I cover the team in person daily in Dove Valley, all throughout the entire offseason, all throughout the regular season. You get those updates here. You can also check out my written work over there at milehighsports.com. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And really on today's episode, here's what we have in store for you, Broncos Country. We're going to go through our players to watch during week 2 of organized team activities. We're going to ask the question, which players could we see return this week to the practice field? And more importantly, what is the next step for the Broncos quarterback competition and each of the 3 players at that position? We're going to break that down. We're going to really kick off today's episode with that theme right there. All eyes are going to be on the Broncos quarterback competition this offseason. But look here, Broncos Country, I think it's important that we talk about this. Like, this is going to be the main story for this team until the starter is announced officially by Sean Payton. But there's a way that I think we can cover it that's not going to drive Broncos Country crazy, right? You're going to see a lot of clickbait. You're going to see a lot of hot takes out there. But I think rather than trying to keep score, who won the day, trying to keep a scorecard on every single day on what this quarterback did, this quarterback didn't do, like that right there, I just think creates a lot of animosity. It creates a lot of toxicity in terms of the discourse on the subject matter. If anything, we've all been used to seeing that happen every year that there's been a quarterback competition for the Broncos. And obviously the revolving door, the carousel of quarterbacks, that's been a theme in and of itself. But I think that's what's made a lot of the toxic discourse kind of thrive a little bit, which we're going to try to get away from that. Let's talk about what each of these players did. Let's talk about what they could do well without really keeping a scorecard on what happened on day 2 of OTAs, for example. That stuff doesn't matter. The jobs aren't going to be won and lost on day 1, week 2, or even week 3 organized team activities. It is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I think that's how we're going to cover it here on the show. And I enjoy the conversation. I can't wait to be able to do that. So let's talk about this. What is the next step here in the Broncos quarterback competition this week as OTAs continue for the second week in a row in Dove Valley? Well, first off, let's take a look at really the order. Like, we're not surprised as to how things went overall from Thursday's practice and what we saw. We got out there. Bo Nix was getting the first team reps to start. We're like, okay, interesting, right? You know, we didn't get access Wednesday or Tuesday's practice last week. So after practice, Sean Payton told us, he said on Tuesday, Jarrett was the guy who got the first team reps, you know, on that first practice. Zach got the first team reps on that second day of practice. And the practice that we happened to be watching ended up being Bo Nix. I imagine it's going to stay a little bit of the same this week as OTAs commence Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday here in Dove Valley. And I think the major question here is, okay, what do we read out of this situation? Like, when we do attend practice, what are we looking for here of these 3 quarterbacks? I think everyone is going to be looking, okay, who makes the biggest throw of the day, right? Who makes the highlight-worthy play? Who throws interceptions? Things like that. But you have to understand all of this stuff, like those big plays, the mistakes, all that gets encapsulated into one for each of these guys. Like, one bad day is not going to define the quarterback competition here, because I don't think all of us, media members, fans included, none of us truly know what are the real things that Sean is looking for. Like, we know a little bit of the lower hanging fruit stuff, like the more general things that we're looking for that we know Sean wants, right? Sean, as we all know, when it comes to quarterback play, we want to see someone who's going to protect the football. He said that. Can you win within the pocket? Like, that's another element here. That's why I think when you look at these 3 quarterbacks, they do have a tendency to stay in the pocket. Now, Zach Wilson probably has a more clear body of work running for his life and trying to make plays happen downfield, especially in his time with the New York Jets. You saw that. Can he avoid that, or is that going to be a situation that applies to him here in Denver? So much is contingent upon the different offensive line lineups that you're doing. And look, right now, there's no pads in OTA. So, you're not really going to see offensive tackle or a guard. Like, you're not going to really see a lot of physical contact. You're not going to be able to see the guys manhandle each other the way they would if they had pads on, and not to mention it's your own teammate. So that's why I think you see a lot of teams embrace during training camp. Obviously, joint practices. The Broncos going to host the Green Bay Packers in week 2 of the preseason for some of those joint practices. It allows you to get a different look, and you don't necessarily have to let off a little bit. You don't want to hurt your own teammates, but you don't want to hurt anybody. But you want to be aggressive. You want to be physical in that regard. And I think we're going to see that here. So for these quarterbacks, what am I looking for here with Bo Nix this week? For Bo, I want to see if he can build off of what I saw him do last week at practice. I thought he had an efficient day. Now, there were some times where, a couple of his passes were a little bit behind receivers, but we're also talking about that's just a timing concept, right? Like, it's different. Like, when you're running crossing patterns or you're running different routes that attack the middle of the field, like, you have to understand, okay, what's the pressure like around me? And there were several times where Nik Bonitto was in the backfield very quickly off of the left side. So where Garrett Bowles was, like, he got some good reps and some snaps out of that. But Bo did a really good job last week, in my opinion, of sensing the pressure, staying calm, stepping up in the pocket, and delivering a strike and throwing the ball, connecting with Josh Reynolds, connecting with some other guys, Lucas Kroll. I liked what I saw from Bo Nix. Can he continue to build on that this week? And can some of his passes were a little bit behind some receivers? Can he make that adjustment going into this week? That's one thing I want to see there. For Jarrett Stidham, I thought Jarrett last week had a really solid practice on Thursday in terms of just commanding the operation. Good ball placement on a lot of his throws. You didn't really see any glaring mistakes from him, but you also didn't see a lot of big plays from the offense in that regard either. Jarrett was consistent. He was steady. Can you see him make a couple of plays this week? That's one thing I want to see in terms of the passing game. Zach Wilson, the only quarterback that we saw during Thursday's practice last week, the only quarterback who threw an interception. And look, I liked where he was going with it. Watching the route develop itself, it looked like there were 2 receivers kind of in the same area. Not sure if one of those guys ran the wrong route. Zach looked like he threw the ball in the right spot, but because you're too close together, your spacing wasn't great. You have 2 defenders in there. So one defender funneled off the receiver that was making, some sort of in-breaking route and allowed the other defensive back to jump the pass there, right? Can you maybe limit the turnovers, right? He's the only guy there. Aside from that, I like his arm strength. And can you see him build on that? What can he do? Like, what is the order going to be when we attend practice this week in terms of who's getting the quarterback reps? I think overall the quarterback competition right now, Broncos country, I think it's in a solid spot. Like, I'm not looking too far ahead. I don't think you should look too far ahead as well. These guys are competing and they're doing a pretty solid job. Like, it seems like a true competition in terms of how practice is run. Is it really competitional? That's the question that we do have here. But each quarterback getting the same opportunities, the same number of reps in a practice per period. That right there, you want to see the larger body of work. Can you see these adjustments carried forward that maybe you're like, okay, they could be better at that next week? That's what we're looking for this week here at Broncos OTAs, without any of the clickbait, without any of the hot takes about, wow, this guy's just running away with it. That's not the case. And if you hear that, it's not true. Like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I want to reiterate that to everybody in Broncos country. Sean Payton's going to say the same exact thing to everybody as well. But one thing we are going to analyze here in today's episode of the show is we look ahead to what we can expect at week 2 of Broncos OTAs. Could we see Greg Dulcich return this week at practice? It's something we're going to analyze, and some other players here in today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And Game Time makes getting tickets to the NBA Finals even faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer that it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. They also take the guesswork out of buying tickets for the NFL season, especially the Broncos home opener in week 2 against Russell Wilson and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Game Time has exclusive deals that you can get in as maybe it gets a little bit closer to kickoff, or if you want to secure them ahead of time, they have that right there inside the Game Time app. And the one thing I like about using the Game Time app, not only do I get great last-minute deals where I can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and other events that are going on near me. I also like that they have all-in pricing, which shows me my total up front, so I'm not left with any surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Will we see tight end Greg Dulcich and defensive tackle DJ Jones return to practice this week as the Broncos begin week 2 of organized team activities? We'll break that down here on today's episode show real quick. I want to say, Broncos Country, if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, I got to ask you a question. Why are you doing that to yourself? You got to turn down the volume with all that shouting and all these talking heads try to do, and you need to make the switch to the Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that's programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. You want to know what's going on a national scale, but on a local level? Well, Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or for free on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, I want to also say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day as we continue to preview week 2 of organized team activities. Our focus now shifts on, will we see several players return this week that missed last week when we were able to attend practice, right? And look, granted, what we saw on Thursday in terms of guys who missed practice, we don't have clarification on whether or not they missed Wednesday or Tuesday's practice. Thursday could have been a Veterans Day off for some of these guys. Some guys had, dealing with some injuries on the side field. Some guys had something happen during that practice, specifically where they pulled up. And then some guys were out with an illness. But first and foremost, let's start off with the question mark here. Will Greg Dulcich return to practice this week for the Broncos? I think this is going to be an interesting storyline to follow, considering what Sean Payton had told us last week. Look, we really have seen the emergence of Lucas Kroll, and I think a lot of that pressure, okay, Greg not being on the field, you start to wonder, okay, like, is Greg slowly but surely losing his spot on the roster? Well, you can't make the club from the tub. That's a good old saying that obviously everybody in Broncos Country knows, but Sean Payton did tell us that we should expect to see Dulcich back on the field sooner rather than later. And then he said, this isn't one of those things where you're going to see him back on the field for training camp. You're going to see him back on the field before that, right? So here we are, week 2 of OTAs. We've got an opportunity this week, got an opportunity next week, and then there's mandatory minicamp 2.5 weeks from now. That's going to give us a little bit more of an idea, okay, like where are things at? Who's definitely going to be returning, because everything is mandatory. And if you're not there during mandatory, you get fined a certain amount of money. And that's going to open up a lot of eyes in terms of that. But will Greg Dulcich return this week is probably a big question. Now, he was working on the team's side field last Thursday when we were there at practice, and watching him come off the practice field, I mean, he's walking normal. He was moving well over on the side field, but it's just about integrating him in the right way, right? And look, here's the thing. As frustrated as Broncos Country may be about Greg Dulcich's injury history, the fact that he's not been able to be on the practice field, I've had some people say, well, since the season ended, between now, there's been so much time. Greg's focus this offseason has been revolving a lot of checkups and a lot of just different work to just be able to see where things are at, because when you have a hamstring issue the way that he does, and I think his is a little unprecedented in a sense, like he's had 4 hamstring injuries to the same hamstring 2 years in a row. He does great. He goes through the recovery process, looks really great, looks explosive, and then suffers a setback, and then it sets him back another 6 to 8 weeks. Denver has just been trying to be at a point now, and also they've been working with Greg. Bo Lowry and Greg have been working on this. Sean Payton is on board with it. They've just been working on a plan to try to reduce that from happening. Look, there's no guarantees about that. And I also want to remind people, nobody's as frustrated about his injury situation than Greg Dulcich himself. Like, Greg wants to be out there playing. We all know when Greg is healthy, he can be a difference maker, and we've seen flashes of it. But when you're not getting it consistently enough, it creates frustration in the eyes of the fan base, and rightfully so. But let's also bring it to the point where it's not Greg's fault that he's injured. You can be frustrated by the fact that he's injured, he's not available to play, but don't be disrespectful to Greg. Don't be rude to Greg. Like, if it were up to Greg, Greg would never be injured. Greg would never have hamstring issues. So just want to put that out there. But if he does return this week, how does it impact the lineup in terms of what we see from the tight end rotation? Are we going to see him participate really in just individual period and also routes on air? Are we going to see him get any team reps? I think if Dulcich returns this week, don't expect to see him involved in many team reps or really any at all. Expect him to be acclimated back with individual period and also working in on routes on air, where it's just quarterbacks throwing to receivers and tight ends. I think that right there is good work for Greg. And then eventually you build up, like maybe by mandatory minicamp, maybe Greg can do more things involved in teamwork, right? Maybe he returns to team this week, but I think if we're setting the expectation, he has not practiced just yet. You look at it where he's at. How do you ease him along, and how do you be smart about it? That's the approach. That's where the Broncos are sitting at right now with Greg Dulcich. We would love to see him return this week. We'll see if that is the case. But another player who missed Thursday's practice due to an illness, veteran defensive tackle DJ Jones, obviously missed last week. Will he be back this week at practice? I will say this, though. The Broncos, I felt like in this offseason, on paper, they went out and they addressed defensive tackle. They addressed adding some more beef to the defensive line. They go out and they get Malcolm Roach. They go out and they get Angelo Blackson, who's a veteran player. Look, probably not going to be a guy who starts a lot of games for you, but if you have an injury and you need a guy to step up, why not get veteran experience there at that regard? And I think that's what the Broncos did. And so last week at practice, we saw a combination of Roach and Blackson, and they have fun personalities, I'd say, these two in the defensive line room. I think when you combine that, DJ Jones, we all know how he is personality-wise. He's a funny guy, knows how to turn it on, knows when to turn it on. You get the same thing from Malcolm Roach. You get the same thing from Angelo Blackson. So I think it's going to make that room right there, defensive tackle, very, very fun to watch. What's going to look like? Obviously, you have Zach Allen at defensive end. You have other guys mixing and matching a little bit. But the idea here is to have it to where it's Zach Allen, it's Malcolm Roach, and it's DJ Jones at the defensive end position. And obviously, not even talking about this, like John Franklin Myers. We haven't even had John Franklin Myers back into the mix here just yet. He's had some stuff he's going to take care of. There is a chance he's back this week, obviously after being traded during the NFL draft from the New York Jets to the Denver Broncos. And if that is the case, you're now going to see just, I think, a different lineup with Jamar Cain, Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers. You're going to have DJ Jones. You're going to have these guys being interchangeable, where Franklin could go down. He can play the 1. He can play the 3. He can play the 2I. So can DJ. Like, you have two guys who are interchangeable, and then you have Zach Allen, and then you're going to rotate other guys in like Malcolm Roach, Angelo Blackson at this point. Like, Denver's identity defensively, at least in the trenches, is to stay fresh and to have a multitude of guys there. They can stay healthy. That might be the most improved area that this team makes from a roster standpoint from last year to this year. And certainly it would be a welcome sight if that is the case here for the Broncos in terms of where they're at defensively. And then I think we also have to ask the question as well, is this going to be the week? Will Courtland Sutton make his appearance? Now, look, right now, it's just been a game of tug of war between he and the Denver Broncos. He's been training in Florida. He's posting the daily deposits over there. He's putting in a lot of work. Like, he's staying ready. I'm not worried about Courtland Sutton, not being here at OTAs. I think a lot of people are saying, well, it's a distraction. It's really not a distraction. Everything right now in OTAs is entirely voluntary. Would you love for Courtland to be there? Yes, absolutely. Is it hurting the team? Not necessarily. I think you can maybe make the argument, okay, if you want to get acclimated to a young quarterback or any of these quarterbacks that are vying to be the starter this year, like, you want to get as many reps as possible with them. That, I think, is an area where you can make the argument, okay, they might be hurting just a little bit there, but really, we're eyeing that June 11th, June 13th date of mandatory minicamp. Is Courtland going to be back by then, right? Because that's when it's mandatory. That's when he starts to get hit in the pocketbook a little bit from not being in attendance. But it would be nice to see if number 14 make his return this week at practice and go about, like, could it be a show of good faith? Are the Broncos going to at least just give him something at this point in time based on what he did last year? Like, there's valid arguments to be made on both sides, but who's going to win this game of tug of war? Is there going to be a meeting in the middle at some point? I'm not sure, but it's something to keep an eye on here. Will we see Courtland Sutton return this week to Broncos OTAs? And look, obviously we look at some of those storylines in terms of players who may be returning this week to practice. We're also going to keep our eye on which player should Broncos country keep their eyes on going into week 2 of OTAs. We'll dive deep into that and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you know it, FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And right now it is winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL. And FanDuel, they're giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. For the NBA, Western Conference, Eastern Conference Finals, you got the NHL on the ice as everyone's looking for the Stanley Cup and everyone's looking toward the NBA Finals. FanDuel is a great place to get in on the action right now, because right now new customers, they get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So if you sign up today as a brand new customer, you go on and you place a $5 bet on any of the games that are ongoing, where you do stat lines, money lines, player props, whatever you want to put $5 on. If that bet wins, you're automatically going to be rewarded with $150 in bonus bets if you are a new customer and you sign up here today. So make sure you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we'll focus on who are some players that you should keep your eye on this week, that I'll have my eyes on at practice this week when the Broncos host week 2 of OTAs. Real quick, I want to say thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get us for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, so make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team, especially as OTAs continues to heat up. And look, last week, I think all of our focus was on the quarterback position. We're looking at the wide receiver room, who's going to step up without Courtland Sutton. Is Courtland going to make it to OTAs? That has now come and gone. And so now it's like, okay, hey, after 1 week of practice, we already know who we had our eye on last week, and they kind of met the bar a little bit. Now, who are some names that we didn't necessarily talk about enough this past week that we should focus on here in week 2 of OTAs? I think first name that we should bring up here is Nik Bonitto. Now, I can tell you this, in the practice that I witnessed last week on Thursday, he looks explosive. He looks fast. His get off the line of scrimmage is really good. Times the snap relatively well. Had a lot of pressure in terms of getting around Garrett Bowles in a couple of instances. Would have made some plays behind the line of scrimmage if there were pads and if obviously it was a real game situation. So I've loved what I've seen from Nik Bonitto. You want to continue to see that from him here. And I think really from looking at his rookie season to his second year, he made such a drastic jump forward. And I expect him to make an even bigger jump forward this week. Now, I think a lot of the question is there going to be a competition at outside linebacker for, a starting job? Or is it going to be Jonathan Cooper and Baron Browning leading the way? I mean, obviously, both those guys are in contract years. The Broncos obviously invested a late second-round pick into Nik Bonitto, and Nick, so far, I think really kind of turned the perception on him around last year with his performance. I just think that he's going to be too good of a player this year to not be on the field in certain moments. So I'm going to be very curious to see what the Broncos decide to do, how they try to manage this rotation at the edge rusher position. Nik Bonitto, obviously, going to be one of the guys I have my eye on this week as we return to practice for week 2 of OTAs. Like what I saw there, is he going to be getting some opportunities, maybe starting opposite of Jonathan Cooper? We saw what happened last time those guys started. I mean, it really came after that week 3 debacle against the Miami Dolphins where he had the Nik Bonitto pressure, Justin Fields strip sacked him. Jonathan Cooper had the scoop and score. They play really well off of one another. And obviously the first and second leading sack artists on the team last year, Jonathan Cooper, 8.5 sacks, Nik Bonitto, 8 sacks last year. A lot of pressures combined between those two players, and pressure is paramount in the National Football League. So Nick is a guy that I have my eye on this week here at practice. But if I'm going to shift gears here to the offensive side of the ball, I'm going to keep my eye on Troy Franklin, obviously, who the Broncos drafted, pairing up with Bo Nix as well. We talked so much, especially in yesterday's episode of the show, what we saw from Tim Patrick coming back. And obviously, he has Sean Payton classified that right now he's the leader in that room. Josh Reynolds being a second guy. He and Devon Vele are really two players that are also making plays. Denver's wide receiver room right now, I think when you look at it and you look at it on a name basis, people are going to be like, in terms of you look at name stature, okay, it's not really much in terms of production and proven, success in the National Football League. I think that Denver's got solid contributors all around the board. And I think the idea is that you have to have this Madden level type of receiving, in terms of who you have in your core. I think that's kind of overplayed, like the value of it. I think you have some guys that can contribute. You have guys that can step up. Are they the flashy names so far in terms of what you see around the rest of the NFL? With some teams that are really loaded at the wide receiver position. Not necessarily, but I think that if Denver can stay healthy, if Courtland Sutton is back in the mix, like you're telling me a wide receiver room that contains Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Marvin Mims, if he can be utilized the correct way, Troy Franklin, Devon Vele, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Josh Reynolds, like you're telling me that these guys can't contribute and make big plays and create some excitement for Denver offensively. I don't buy into that. I think that they can. I think that this wide receiver room is a lot better than most people are going to give it credit for. Now, what do we have to do in order to maybe prove that evaluation or that thought process? Well, you have to see that carry over in the preseason. You're going to have to see that translate into some real game situations in the regular season. We don't know what that room is going to look like right now when we talk about maybe building out the entire 53-man roster. But if they can find a way to get these guys to stay healthy and they can go out there and they can make plays. Let's say Denver's offense has a balance between the run and the pass. They're having success on the ground. I mean, it opens things up significantly, and I think you're going to allow some of these guys who are developing behind your main starters, you're going to give them opportunities to thrive. And I think, obviously, for me, I'm looking at Troy Franklin this week because of his speed. I mean, you can line him up anywhere. You can line him up on the outside. You can line him up on the inside. He's a great yard after the catch threat here. I want to see what he can do across the middle of the field. at the NFL level. So I'm going to have my eye on him this week when we talk about some young offensive players to keep an eye on. But now I'm also going to shift gears to one of the other Broncos rookie draft picks from this year's NFL draft, and that's Chris Abrams-Draine. Obviously, it's a little different seeing someone else wear the number 31 in Denver, but I'll tell you this, watching him in Thursday's practice, watching him work on the outside, watching him work on the inside, as we talked about positional versatility, I mean, I think he's got great technique. He can play press man coverage. He can play off-ball coverage. He's got good instincts. And I think he understands how to leverage himself, right? Despite being a little undersized at the cornerback position, like he's 5'11", he's a little bit taller than me by 1 inch, but he plays big and he plays smart. And I think that's one area while you see him make plays, while you saw him make plays at Mizzou, he understands route concepts. He understands, okay, if you have two wide receivers that are within 5 yards splits, or let's say they're closer, more condensed, he understands how to play the leverage game there. And he's very good at timing, like using his hand to get in phase, squeeze, use the sideline. We call it the 12th man, squeezing the sideline to make a play on the football, right? If he's going to try to catch it inbounds, try to get the guy out of bounds. Like at the college level, you can get 1 foot in and be in bounds. But at the NFL level, you need 2 feet, right? So use that sideline. I think he's got good instincts. He's smart. He understands the defensive concepts that Jim Leonard's asking him to do. I've got my eye on him a little bit more this week. And also want to see, is he going to maybe establish himself at one particular role? Like, while I love the idea that Leonard is rotating the Broncos corners inside and outside, is he going to stand out specifically in one area, right? Because last week we talked about Jaquan McMillan. Jaquan stood out in a big way last week during practice, playing outside corner. And so if you can maybe maximize, let's say Jaquan is going to be in serious consideration for that cornerback 2 spot opposite of PS2, well, can you put Chris Abrams-Draine inside the nickel there? I think you absolutely can. I think you put him on the outside. I think you got to factor him into the consideration there. I like where Denver's at right now. It just seems like they have a lot of options here. Now, granted, when you're going with some young guys, you're going to have to take some of the bumps and bruises that come along that too, because you're going to be facing this year some very experienced wide receiving cores. You're going to face some tough challenges. And can these guys who are young that just played college, can they just come in and rise up to the moment at the NFL level? Like you see it every year. There's no guarantee of it. You just have high hopes that you can do that. And I think so far from a confidence standpoint, watching Abrams-Draine in practice, he seems comfortable. He seems confident. And look, it's competitive when you're seeing these DBs take on these wide receivers in team period. I'm loving it so far. I can't wait to see a little bit more. And then I'm going to go with another guy. I'm going to go with the guy at the safety position, JL Skinner. Obviously, if you've seen some of the photos and videos I've shared on social media, JL, obviously, we all know how tall he is, but he looks bigger. He looks like he put on quite a bit of muscle this offseason, but he's also moving really well. And I'm very curious to see what type of role that the Broncos try to carve out for him, because I think when you look at where he's at, he could totally play. Like right now, you look at safety. Ideally, you project the regular season to be PJ Locke, Brandon Jones is your 2 starters there. Caden Stearns being the guy that's going to rotate in different personnel packages. But where does JL Skinner fit into the mix here for Denver? I think that's a great question. Could we see him play that dime linebacker role? Could we maybe see him move up to play some edge rusher in certain situations? Maybe. I mean, I think you look at his body type and it's like, why can't you try certain things out with him? The main thing here with JL, and this is something I'm also paying attention to because you're seeing a lot of it at practice. Like Denver's going to do the 7-on-7 stuff. They're going to do the routes on air, individual period. They're going to do the team 9-on-7, 11-on-11. But when they transition and they go in between their special teams periods, my eyes are on JL Skinner. What units is he working with? Is he getting involved on punt? Is he getting involved on punt return? Is he involved on kick return? These are things that I'm looking for this week. And once I get that answer, once I see a little bit more, look, I'm going to obviously bring that back and share, obviously, with all of you on Broncos Country. I've had people ask me about JL Skinner. He moves really well for his size. And I think for as big as he's gotten, like, I like a little bit of what I see. Like, he could be a little bit of a weapon. Like, I don't think he's going to necessarily have a designated safety role. I think you can move him around a little bit, kind of use him as a chess piece player if we're talking about maximizing his potential. I'm very curious to see where the Broncos decide to go with him. And obviously, I'll give you that type of coverage this week as week 2 of OTAs continues in Dove Valley. But with that said, Broncos Country, that will wrap up today's episode. Locked On Broncos here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. For all you everydayers out there in Broncos Country, as we get one step closer to being able to see practice once again this week, we're going to also look at some of the other positions here. We're going to talk about the Broncos running back position. I tell you what, right now, it's an interesting point of conversation right now. Who's the odd man out? What's Javonte Williams looking like? What does Jaleel McLaughlin look like? We're going to focus on the running back position, some of the storylines accompanying that a little bit more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then.